Hello, and welcome to Intelligence Network Crime Event Review, episode number 2, 23 April 2025. Today, I want to start things off by discussing some conclusions I'm starting to draw from having done the previous episode 1 on Easter Sunday. I've watched the sync that I made with the movie Zodiac from that episode, and it's starting to reveal some information to the effect that I'm more confident that it was the Manson family that committed the murders at 10050 Cielo Drive, as indications in that sync are that the people at 10070 Cielo Drive were indeed a watch house for the network, probably unbeknownst to operatives working at the Tate house at 10050 Cielo Drive. Okay, this is kind of how you set things up to an ideal, long established in intelligence circles dating back to the Order of the Assassins, where you keep kind of a controlled oppositional stance nearby that can be turned assassin when required. Okay, so you keep an assassin near significant people that, if they need to be gotten rid of in an organized criminal sense, for whatever reason, they can be gotten rid of. So the dinner party at 10070 Cielo Drive is kind of a cover, because according to that sync, the Manson family members actually had a meal there at 10070 Cielo Drive. They were fed like soldiers, I guess you could say. So they would have parked their car, the yellow and white Ford, probably up there at the house party. And another thing they would have done to bring up, the Capricorn issue again, is they would have brought pig's blood up there in their car with them and just kind of had it in buckets, probably stashed on the road up there. So they would, take the buckets of blood out and very covertly stash them on the road up there. And after the dinner party had left, they would have finished eating, okay, because this is typical of what you do before you go out on a mission. You make sure the soldiers are fed a regular meal, okay, if you can. It's not written in stone or anything, but you make sure your soldiers eat every day, right? Regularly, breakfast, lunch, dinner, or whatever. But certainly within the last 24 hours before going out on a mission, that's one of the things you do as part of the chain of command, is make sure your soldiers are eating and hydrating appropriately, enough to stay, normally hydrated, right? They're not going out on a mission dehydrated, certainly, right? And you kind of run that fine line between being, normally hydrated and maybe amply hydrated, but not not overhydrated, right? But, overhydration isn't that much of a priority to worry about in the military, but certainly, they hydrate regularly, okay? And with the Manson family, they got these houses set up all over Los Angeles, where they're actually allowed to break into the house at night and practice their craft, which Manson, in my opinion, was an expert at, which was basically cat burglary, moneyed people's houses, where they're allowed to steal certain things and, eat out of the refrigerator, or catch a shower, or whatever during the course of a day. It's just a networking accommodation for these operatives, It's kind of how intelligence networks provide on a logistical level, a personnel level, a soldier care level, you might say. Health and welfare kind of a deal. Where your operatives are, maintained as, fully functional operatives so that they can perform mission on short notice in accordance with, guidelines and protocols, right? So you've got the Manson family up there in their Ford. It's kind of a watch post, a temporary watch post, but at the same time, it would be disguised kind of like one of the vehicles attending the dinner party nearby, right? This is why, a lot of these witnesses, they don't respond appropriately to noises they hear. And they know they're not going to be arrested for it because that's not standard procedure for police to arrest people simply because their behavior is a little bit odd or questionable, right? They would just, document it in their reports. But in my opinion, the police officers that were brought to this particular murder scene were already network operatives, right? And there's all kinds of really strange things you can talking about this stuff that's kind of unpleasant to hear because of the sexual nature of it too, right? As I'm kind of going to be discussing a little bit, touching base with, activities going on at 10050 Cielo Drive. As strange as they are. There's a quote right at the beginning of the book, the Beautiful People quote that I read yesterday. How does it feel to be one of the beautiful people, the Beatles, from Magical Mystery Tour? That's an important element in all of this, right? These people are trying to become establishment people, or they're maintaining themselves as establishment people, but also they're trying to get in good with this intelligence networking that has been pretty largely afoot since in the LA area since before World War II, and developed through World War II with all kinds of new site development in the Beverly Hills area and the hills north of Beverly Hills, the canyons, right? I think the canyon networks were established, in obvious terms at least, during and after World War II. So, the people that actually own these houses and rent them out would be network people. Houses nearby 10050 Cielo Drive. And I think, online operatives hint at this by talking about NATO soldiers running around with M16s and M7 bayonets affixed, breaking into Cielo Drive and bayoneting people to death and that kind of stuff. It's symbolism for what I'm about to talk about, right? All kinds of people have been coming out of the woodwork this past decade or half decade along these lines. It seems like, dare I say, in response to what's likely to be revealed in presentations like this, they would know ahead of time, right? Because these people, these networks still exist. The ones that I refer to this network as the California network in general terms. And they seem to have been linking up with what I think of as the Texas network, which would be kind of headquartered in New Orleans, actually. Associated with the JFK assassination, Hollywood, California networking, linking up with Texas networking to accomplish that particular assassination of a significant political figure. But the two guards, William Garretson and Stephen Parent, okay, these are significant individuals along the lines I've just discussed. These are individuals that would be kind of on their way into becoming both Hollywood establishment people and established intelligence network people, right? Whereas people like Abigail Folger, she's already establishment in a socioeconomic sense, right? As far as being wealthy establishment people is concerned. But she would also be working to get in good with this intelligence networking, in my view. Okay, playing all the same symbolic games that these people play. I suspect, and also in intelligence circles, they like to multi-purpose things, the way symbols are easily multi-purposed. Symbols are just kind of like operations, okay, in how they're easily multi-purposed, but you have to control things along those lines relative to your situation. So you're constantly, when you're looking at these symbols and operations, you're constantly, running courses of action through your mind, right? There'll be one that pops up right away, and then there'll be other courses of action that come into mind later, right? Like with this rabbit thing on the headboard, which that's information I ran across for the first time reading Helter Skelter here, because this is my first reading of Helter Skelter, okay, that I'm doing right now. I'm just going to dedicate my recital time during the course of my day on these books. Exercise my Wernicke area and my Broca area, right? Reading these books instead of the other books, which I, study differently, I guess. Textbooks and what have you, but yeah. So multi-purpose ability and courses of action, get mixed up in your mind a little bit, and you sleep on it and wake up in the morning and things seem to have sorted themselves out, right? It's kind of similar to what goes on in the military between an operations office and a command office and a commander, right? And an operations officer. Courses of action are developed, right, in the operations office. And there's a lot of coordination with the command office going on and the commander between these two officers, operations and commander. Executive officer, and these interactions ultimately result in a sorting of things out along a course of action lines, right? Discerning enemy courses of action that are most likely and that have already taken place, and developing own course of action, the final decision being that of the commander, right, of the unit. Selecting courses of action out of a range of courses of action that come up to mind, you might say, between these offices, conducting their own version of intelligence operations, probably coordinating with an intelligence office to do so, right? And a logistics office and a personnel office in accordance with, protocols, standing operational procedures. So this rabbit, though, is kind of one of those symbols. Initially, I thought they would have had to bring the rabbit up as one of their symbols that they have with them, because they played a symbolic game here. They left a knife on a chair, open, a folding knife, sitting in a chair, so that, if you didn't watch what you're doing sitting down on that chair, you might cut yourself, right? You could say that the rabbit's basically the same thing, that they left it there, right? But there's also the possibility, course of action-wise, that Abigail Folger left that rabbit up there to symbolize having been, compromised blackmail-wise into the network, where that rabbit would represent whoever was on the camera witnessing from above the sexual activities being filmed on the couch in the living room. A primary filming location for interactions between the infant and the women, right? I would imagine other rooms in that main house would have been kept as, living areas, right? I would imagine they would have just kept the activity in the living room, filmed from above like a standard procedure. And the activity of a homosexual nature between, the infant and males probably would have been filmed, if it was filmed on site at all, over in the guest house, that picture window with LA in the background. They might have put curtains up or something like that, kind of on the cheap, disguising the area to look more like a regular middle-class household that could be located anywhere in a city like Los Angeles, right? So the rabbit, symbolizes a Goat Network person like a Stephen Parent or a William Garrettson, somebody becoming establishment in some fashion or another, probably. In their cases, both within the Hollywood set and the intelligence networking set, in the area. So this networking, it operates independently of government channels for intelligence networking, but runs through those channels, government channels, in my opinion. Thus, they've got, their presence established pretty extensively in law enforcement in the LA area, reaching up into San Francisco at this point, but definitely strongly established in the LA area, LAPD, for example. You can kind of get a sense that they would have to spend some time scrambling to find the appropriate officers to send up there. Right, they got people in positions to make those decisions. It takes a little while, but they can confuse things by, mixing up the reports as to, what times people arrived or whatever. So it's difficult to discern what's going on, but network people would know what's going on just as soon as they saw this confusion, which normally would not find its way into an investigation, right? These being professionals, trained professionals. Even a police officer is trained on how to handle a crime scene, right? Should be getting accurate times down, carry a pen and a notepad, right? That's even standard for a soldier in the military. Keep a reliable pen like a U.S. government click pen, right? And pad of paper, 3x5 cards nearby at the very least. If you're getting up in rank, you want to keep a notebook nearby or a logbook of some kind, a journal that you use to write information down, about accomplishments that your soldiers accomplished during the course of a week and a month, and then you can write your reports on that, based on that, right? These are disciplines practiced to proficiency, right? And eventually these things become automatic, thus efficient, right? If they're practiced. You have to go through a phase of habituation, though, and related inefficiencies to get those automaticities established for yourself. The neurons that fire together wire together, right? So anyway, Stephen Parent, in my opinion, was likely targeted too, for symbolic reasons. Last name Parent, right? It's a key word. They like to place keywords here and there in the lore. No people pick up on these keywords right away. Okay, they would have understood when he was going to be coming off of duty at midnight or sometime thereabouts, and somebody else would be coming on duty to watch the gate. And they probably had a bunk up there or something, or cot and chair and table up in the room above the parked cars down in the garage, right? Second story of the garage. From that watch post, you could watch that backyard area most likely, although I haven't seen the window that would allow for that in photographs. But definitely they could see, the gate, the front gate area, and remain pretty well hidden up there in that room above the garage. The garage is kind of one of those things that, the untrained individual would tend to write off as non-threatening building with nobody in it, likely, right? If they're trying to get onto the property to cause trouble. And as soon as their backs are turned on that garage and they round a corner, the operative in the garage can come down with something like a silenced Luger or a 45 ACP or something like that, which is hinted at in the movie sync, by the way, with the previous episode. They keep a 45 up there or something like that, equivalent. But yeah, the use of 22 caliber pistols makes perfect sense for these kinds of operations too. People tend to write the sounds that come from those weapons as maybe backfiring or firecrackers but in my view, that's usually the case if you're further distant from the events in question, right? If you're like one of the near neighbors, gunshots going off would bring you right out into at least to the telephone, if not the front yard of your house, right? Or at least to look out the window to see what's going on, maybe call the police. I just heard gunshots or whatever. Yeah, these people at 10070 are not properly paranoid, in my view. That to me is goat networking sign or secret networking sign, right? And of course, satanic cult activity can be patterned right over that as a cover and a scapegoat. The supposed ritual associated with that and all the weird activities mostly not likely taking place. The weird activities would be things like blackmail pornography production for business purposes of intelligence scope, right? So, somebody like Abigail Folger plays these symbolic games, being in on the networking and trying to get in good with these people in Hollywood, I guess. Her professional life is a little bit up in the air, and her relationship with her father supposedly is somewhat compromised, and I'm beginning to suspect she might have been one of the fake murders, but I got to look at things like the autopsy photographs again and kind of discern what's going on with that, because the photography associated with her, with the crime scene of her, is just weird in a way that, Joe Average is likely to overlook. It'll pass right over his head, but no people know what they're looking at right away. Networked know people, KNOW people. Yeah. And she could just as easily have left that rabbit up there on the headboard to symbolize her. It's kind of like a Lucky Charm memory she maintains for herself. Kind of like the Mona Lisa kept around the room until death as a reminder. Somebody's got your soul, so to speak, because vampirism, out-of-body vampirism, is conducted in conjunction with these events taking place to ensure, network conformity. If you conform all the way until you're dead, you would be welcomed back in time or something like that. Abigail Folger wasn't quite 26 when she died, or maybe was fake murdered here. Her death was maybe faked. I'm convinced this is the case with Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring. Yeah, I lost track there a little bit. I had to page through the book here. I'm looking at photographs of the scene here, so I'm going to have to take back what I said about Abigail Folger's photograph in the yard. Clearly they've got her on her back supine here in the book. I might have misremembered the photographs associated with this scene that I've seen in the past. You got Wojtek Frykowski on his side here, kind of on his side, and Abigail Folger on her back near a drain in the yard, but they whited out the actual bodies, right, that can be seen, except for the towel over Jay Sebring's head. So, it just might be, though, that, yeah, there's a chance that they faked all these deaths, but maybe it was like a horror show thing they did for the infant that was up there to horrify the infant. I don't know. Because, the thing is with the, that garage overlooks that backyard. There had to have been a window in that garage. Yeah, there's some good photographs in this book to use to make sense of things. Where's the car located? Yeah, that garage is ideally located as an observation post, but also as a garage, of course, right? Multi-purposing. And they got a floor plan of the house here, too. So there is a bedroom right there on the corner of the house. Perfect watch position, right? On the other side of the kitchen and dining room from the living room area. Yeah, it's all here in the book. This is actually quite a... Well, it's an informative book. These books always are, right? The interesting thing is an intelligence network would pride themselves on their abilities to emulate anything they want, including crime scene. I mean, literally controlling everything. Predicting behavior, controlling people's behavior, but controlling what they produce, certainly, like a Hollywood production or something. Yeah, really good photography here. The barn proportions of the house, even, it's even more barn than what is typical in the area, I suppose. There's the knife in the chair. You sit down on that thing, you could stab yourself. So that rabbit on the headboard could have been left by the perpetrators or Abigail Folger. If they faked her death, she would have been involved in that process to some degree too. But murder is a very unpleasant business, I suppose, even if you're an intelligence operative of some kind, right? Actual murder. Yeah. Just imagine if you yourself had murdered someone. What would that feel like, right? Some people, it's the kind of thing that brings guilt to awareness for the first time, Maybe. I don't know. The sensation of guilt. If you've ever felt guilty over anything you've done, thank your lucky stars that you're capable of feeling that way, right? Hopefully you haven't done anything really bad in life. So I suppose I should start reading. Let's see, how much of a corner did I talk myself into here? Yeah, the whole idea of the rabbit symbol, right? It's like the Playboy bunny. Okay, it's a sex symbol and it's Capricorn symbol. You could say it's a phallic symbol. It's a little doll, a little hug toy type thing for kids to keep them emotionally stable while in their early formative years. So it's the same idea as a Lucky Charm type memory. You lose a lot, I suppose, when these vampires hit you, and then you're completely dedicated to being loyal to these networks, right? The vampires hit you, they take memories, they take the libido, the love, the emotion associated with those memories to a large degree. The memories you're left with are comparatively, shall we say, Capricorn, in the sense they're not the high fidelity stuff that these vampires seem to value for total recall purposes that, they have experience with. So somebody like Stephen Parent could wind up with Abigail Folger's memories of, being establishment people during her formative years. You could argue that these memories are effectively loaned for a period of time, if and they could get their memories back if they're loyal network people until they're dead. Once you're a member of the CIA, supposedly you are a member of the CIA for life, that kind of a deal, right? Only, the idea is extended out into other kinds of networking of intelligence scope having to do with establishment people maintaining social networks. So the headboard would be like symbolic of the mask worn by someone's past, right? The past you can dream into to totally recall in a dream form, a high fidelity dream kind of a deal. Because, you sleep in the bed in the present. The headboard symbolizes the starting point going back into the past, and there's a rabbit sitting up there on the headboard. Almost like a Edgar Allan Poe story, right? Kind of put up there. So they leave symbols, right? These things that were left laying around, they're all Capricorn symbols. The pig's blood, they would have, when they went in to do the murder, they would have brought the buckets of pig's blood from over by the neighbor's house and to slosh it around the living room a bit and, set up a photographable scene, right? I got to go looking at all the photography of the scene, the murder scene, and the autopsy all over again. I'm still convinced they definitely killed Wojtek Frykowski, though the pre-autopsy photography for Stephen Parent, that's convincing stuff. I got to go look at Abigail Folger's stuff again. I think that's available. Her father spent, years and years making sure that her name was kept out of print as much as possible, right? That could be a cover for her to continue to stay alive as somebody drummed out of the network. Or it could be protecting the legacy of her life and the family name associated with a brand, right? A combination of those kinds of things, right? Protecting the family, protecting the memories of someone deceased, or somebody who had to change their identity to get out of networking safely, right? Take on an assumed identity and start a new life. Not allowed to be in the limelight at all. Unless, of course, you can successfully do it with your new identity, as Sharon Tate made an attempt to do, according to Miles Mathis. So I got to look at Miles Mathis's take on these crime scenes all over again in his paper, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I think it's titled, same as the movie title. So I think I can get to reading now. Having discussed all those issues. the killer's coming up the road situation, right? I mean, that the situation with the late 50s Ford converted into kind of a pickup truck that they drove up there. I mean, that's multi-purposable, same as a lot of other symbols, right? It can be, you know, a watching point. It can be logistics, you know, truck effectively, like a military truck is a logistics resource for moving personnel and logistics around, ammunition and what have you. Intelligence, logistics would work in a way similar to the way it works in the military. Okay, transportation is a logistics protocol item that you keep track of as a matter of course. You always have transportation lined up to be used on short notice, right? And it's considered a logistics asset. Okay, and then they drive back down the road that they know is clear now of people that could potentially witness. They've surveyed the whole area. They've scouted it while inside that vehicle and also while they were parked up there. So then they drive it back down and then walk back up. The bunny rabbit thing could have been Abigail Folger or them, but if you're going to be all business on this level, maybe walking around with a bunny rabbit doesn't suit the situation, if you catch my drift. So, yeah, when you're taking into consideration all these ideas bounce around in your head for a while. Multi-purposable ideas, you might say. Multi-purposable because they're symbols and also because the situation suggests courses of action, right, that likely took place versus, you know, what likely will take place after that point and likely took place previous to that, you know, the events in question. So here we go. Weisenhunt went to the right around the back of the house. DeRosa turned left, proceeding around the front. Burbridge followed as backup. Stepping onto the screened-in porch, DeRosa could see in the living room on a couch facing the front door a youth of about 18. He was wearing pants but no shirt, and though he did not appear to be armed, This did not mean, DeRosa would later explain, that he didn't have a weapon nearby. Yelling "freeze," DeRosa kicked in the front door. Startled, the boy looked up to see one, then moments later, 3 guns pointing directly at him. Christopher Altabelli's large Weimaraner charged Weisenhunt, chomping the end of his shotgun. Weisenhunt slammed the porch door on his head, then held him trapped there until the youth called him off. As to what then happened, there are contrary versions. The youth, who identified himself as William Garretson, the caretaker, would later state that the officers knocked him down, handcuffed him, yanked him to his feet, dragged him outside onto the lawn, then knocked him down again. DeRosa would later be asked, reference Garretson. Question: did he fall or stumble to the floor at any time? Answer: he may have. I don't recall whether he did or not. Question: did you direct him to lay on the ground outside? Answer: I directed him, yes, to lay on the ground, yes. Question: did you help him to the ground? Answer: no, he went down on his own. If you're interviewing a witness, you can lead the witness into answering questions, along expected lines. Maury Terry had a reputation for doing that with people like David Berkowitz that he interviewed. He would ask leading questions, right? Which is something you avoid doing if you're seriously professional. Gerritsen kept asking, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" One of the officers replied, "Well, we'll show you," and pulled him to his feet. DeRosa and Burbridge escorted him back along the path toward the main house. Now, this is all according to accounts, right? One of the things I've learned studying these books and other issues involving psychology is that eyewitness accounts very often turn out to be unreliable for a variety of reasons. Gerritsen kept asking, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" One of the officers replied, "We'll show you," and pulled him to his feet. Yeah, what's the matter? I don't know how people talked in the late 60s. That sounds a little odd. That's kind of a sign, a tell, you might say, maybe written in the book here. Written into the lore, Anything odd, could be a sign, right? Or a tell of some kind. Yeah, a tell is a more appropriate terminology. These kinds of tells only tell the trained eye certain things, right? It's like you're playing poker every time you pick up one of these books. Weisenhunt remained behind looking for weapons and blood-stained clothing. Though he found neither, he did notice many small details of the scene. One at the time seemed so insignificant that he forgot it until later questioning brought it back to mind. There was a stereo next to the couch. It had been off when they entered the room. Looking at the controls, Weisenhunt noticed that the volume setting was between 4 and 5. Fender tube amp volume settings of, kind of typical volume settings, right? To get on the edge of a certain kind of sound, you might say, a singing blues guitar sound, right? But maybe I'm talking out of turn here a bit. So Gerritsen, meantime, had been led past the two bodies on the lawn. It was indicative of the condition of the first, the young woman, that he mistakenly identified her as Mrs. Chapman, the Negro maid. As for the man, he identified him as the young Polanski. If, as Chapman and Essen had said, Polanski was in Europe, this made no sense. What the officers couldn't know was that Gerritsen believed Wojtek Frykowski to be Roman Polanski's younger brother. Gerritsen failed completely when it came to identifying the young man in the Rambler. Who did he drink the beer with then? Supposedly, according to toxicology reports, he had been drinking like the equivalent of a drink that night, or maybe at the most two, but probably no more than one, considering, one drink, 1 hour rule. You stick around for the better part of the hour drinking that one beer, and you shouldn't be intoxicated at all by the time you leave, right? If you have 2 beers, then it's 2 hours that you're kind of there, right? So, you kind of figure out how long you can stay at a bar, for example, where there's a 2-drink minimum. That means, they expect you to be there maybe as long as the better part of 2 hours. Shouldn't be stumbling out the door, if you're a proper customer, I suppose. But standard drink, of course, with a standard dose of alcohol. So, who did he drink the beer with then? Supposedly, according to some accounts, he was trying to sell a clock radio to this individual here, Gerritsen. Steve Parent was trying to sell him a clock radio, which is kind of an unlikely story. It's kind of a bit on the implausible side of things, right? enough to the point where, as far as I'm concerned, it's a tell as to this is a cover, along those lines. At some point, no one recalls exactly when, Garrison was informed of his rights and told that he was under arrest for murder. Asked about his activities the previous night, he said that although he had remained up all night, writing letters and listening to records, he had neither heard nor seen anything. Yeah, I mean, this could be a rehearsed story because he probably was up all night. How could you just go to sleep after something like that? You'd be like making sure all your P's and Q's are straight and all your ducks are lined up properly for when the police arrive, because you were told you're going to stay here and greet the police at your door. You're going to wait for the police to arrive or something along those lines. Because, this Garrison guy would have no idea that these police officers would most likely be Netwrok people. In fact, even the murderers would have no idea what kind of police officers are going to show up. It's kind of a typically compartmentalized intelligence situation, right? You can't predict everything, so you make sure everything is as it needs to appear at your level of involvement. So he's probably, expected to remain isolated in the house, perfectly clean of any evidence associated at all with a murder. Probably rehearsed the cover story along these lines here. Yes, I was up all night listening to records and writing letters. It's a little bit implausible if you ask me, but you'd be writing some rather drunken letters, you might say. Staying up all night writing letters, in my view. His highly unlikely alibi, his vague, unrealistic replies, vague and unrealistic in quotes, and his confused identification of the bodies led the arresting officers to conclude that the suspect was lying. 5 murders, 4 of them probably occurring less than 100 feet away, and he had heard nothing? Yeah, there would be like screaming if anything real were happening, right? Yeah, I mean, come on. How could you not hear that? Even the .22 caliber gunshots sound like gunshots, and they can be heard echoing around. I mean, writing letters and listening to loud records at the same time, yeah, implausible in my view. Drunken, late night, early morning hours letters that, would probably wouldn't be a good idea to mail them off the next morning. Who knows? I try to write my letters when I'm fully daylight sober. I mean, look how I sound on the microphone here in the middle of the day even. So, escorting Garrison down the driveway, DeRosa located the gate control mechanism on the pole inside the gate. He noticed that there was blood on the button. The logical inference was that someone, quite possibly the killer, had pressed the button to get out, in so doing very likely leaving a fingerprint. Officer DeRosa was charged with securing and protecting the scene until investigating officers arrived. Now pressed the button himself. Now this is, unlikely, another unlikelihood. How often do police officers make these kinds of mistakes? It's hard to say, but yeah, this is goat networking going on here. He's contributing his own contribution to the chaos, right? In my view. Successfully opening the gate, but also creating a super imposture that obliterated any print that may have been there. He might have felt a need to cover that print up too, because guess who might have been allowed to open the gate? A certain infant, given specific instructions. Now place your fingerprint on the button and only one finger, and push the button and see what happens. And the gate opens, and infant, finally gets to open that gate himself or something like that, If it was an adult print, it doesn't say here. Later, DeRosa would be questioned regarding this. This is the kind of thing that also is like effectively an entrapment, because for the police to definitely stick to their guns telling their story, right? Once you tell the story, you stick to your guns now because you're involved in the chaos. So, the infant left behind the word pig at the door, right, in blood. So maybe they had the infant push the button to get out the gate to leave. And the infant would have to walk down the road, leaving the place with the perps, right? And the infant would be told that you are involved in this, and you'd be in a lot of trouble if anybody found out about it. To bring up guilty feelings in the infant and what have you, to help the infant forget, I suppose, as part of the psychological operation going on here. Question: was there some reason why you placed your finger on the bloody button that operated the gate? Answer: so that I could go through the gate. Question: and that was intentionally done? Answer: I had to get out of there. That's implausible. I know that these tend to be emotional situations for a lot of people, but I don't think these situations are so emotional that a trained professional would deviate from, protocol. It was 9:40. DeRosa called in reporting 5 deaths and a suspect in custody, while Burbridge remained behind at the residence. Oh, the police car. He might have had to access the police car. Yeah. He probably could have pushed that button a little bit more intelligently, in my view. Maybe with an object. Like, he's got he's got a flashlight, does he not? Pull it off the belt, hit the button with the thing. Try not to smudge the fingerprint on the button or something. A pen, even. Awaiting the arrival of the this is the kind of problem solving you're perfectly capable of on this in this situation, right? With evidence, I don't imagine police are particularly thoughtless. They would tend to be thoughtful, I would think, right? While Burbridge remained behind at the residence awaiting the arrival of the investigating officers, DeRosa and Weisenhunt drove Garrettson to the West Los Angeles police station for questioning. Another officer took Mrs. Chapman there also, but she was so hysterical she had to be driven to the UCLA Medical Center and given sedation. I mean, that's plausible, but it's also potentially a cover, keep from being questioned right away, or make it so that, hopefully this is the last questioning she'll undergo, maybe, or at least delay the next, series of questions that have to be answered till long enough after the fact. Plus, the whole idea that she just immediately ran from the site, plausible. She could have been in fear for her life, right? So, I have to evaluate these as human behavior that is likely, but also as potentially implausible in the sense of being a cover story at the same time, and multi-purposing again. Courses of action related to, right? Another officer took Mrs. Chapman there also, but she was so hysterical she had to be driven to the UCLA Medical Center and given sedation. In response to DeRosa's call, 4 West Los Angeles detectives were dispatched to the scene. Lieutenant R.C. Madlock, Lieutenant J.J. Gregoire, Gregoire, Sergeant F. Gravante and Sergeant T.L. Rogers. Tell Rogers, or I don't know. I'm looking for symbolism here. Would all arrive within the next hour. By the time the last pulled up, the first reporters were already outside the gate. Monitoring the police radio bands, they had picked up the report of 5 deaths. It was hot and dry in Los Angeles, and fire was a constant concern, especially in the hills, where within minutes lives and property could vanish in an inferno. Someone apparently presumed the 5 people had been killed in a fire. Jay Sebring's name must have been mentioned in one of the police calls because a reporter phoned his residence and asked his butler, Amos Russell, if he knew anything about the deaths by fire. That could be symbolism too. Oblivion, pure oblivion. Aries, secret networking is a fire elemental symbol in an Aries astrological sense of being pure oblivion as quote-unquote pure energy or pure initiative, even that, a secret network would reserve for itself exclusively as exclusively as possible to maintain pure dominance. Okay. Russell called John Madden, president of Sebring International, and told him about the call. Madden was concerned. Neither he nor Sebring's secretary had heard from the hairstylist since late the previous afternoon. Madden placed a call to Sharon Tate's mother in San Francisco. Sharon's father, a colonel in Army intelligence, was stationed at nearby Fort Baker, and Mrs. Tate was visiting him. No, she hadn't heard from Sharon or Jay, who was due in San Francisco sometime that same day. Prior to her marriage to Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate had lived with Jay Sebring. Though thrown over for the Polish film director, Sebring had remained friends with Sharon's parents, as well as Sharon and Roman, and whenever he was in San Francisco, he usually called Colonel Tate. When Madden hung up, Mrs. Tate called Sharon's number. Yeah, why would he always call Colonel Tate? You have to wonder about that, too. Because that could be a tell written in the book to the effect that we're dealing with a chain of command here. Shoot, move, communicate. So you did something, then you move to a safe location, immediately communicate, right? That's a military ideal. That has gotten mixed up in more recent decades as people insist on, altering the order of consideration of those items, not really understanding what is being said when you run those ideas through your head. You just take all 3 of those things into account whenever you do anything in the military. Shoot, move, communicate. Okay, do I need to communicate right now? Right? Do I need to move someplace right now to be better located for mission purposes or for safety purposes, right? Have I completed the mission? Shoot. Basically, that's military mission acronym. You could think, symbolism, right? Shoot, you did something. Could be anything. Do I need to move to a better location? No, so you don't move. Do I need to communicate with somebody right now? Yes, call your boss. But, people become confused over time, and they want to control things and change things on their terms to be in charge and all that kind of stuff. So it becomes something more like communicate, move, and shoot. And don't you dare say anything else within earshot of me, or I'll reprimand you or whatever for saying the wrong sequence of words. But that's the kind of thing that happens in military organizations, right? They kind of miss the point of the words shoot, move, communicate. They're easy to remember that way. These are just 3 ideas you want to take into account when anything significant happens, right? When Madden hung up, Mrs. Tate called Sharon's number. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. It was quiet inside the house. Though anyone who called got a ringing signal, the phones were still out. Officer Joe Granado, a forensic chemist, was SID. A ringing signal, huh? Phone line cut. That is maybe a tell. I'm not an expert on telephone systems, but maybe that was the case in the 60s. I just don't know. But let's see. A forensic chemist with SID, the Officer Joe Granado, a forensic chemist with SID, the Scientific Investigation Division of LAPD. SID, Scientific Investigation Division, all right, was already at work, having arrived about 10 a.m. It was Granado's job to take samples from wherever there appeared to be blood. Usually, on a murder case, Granado would be done in an hour or two. Not today, not at 10050 Cielo Drive. Mrs. Tate called Sandy Tennant, a close friend of Sharon's and the wife of William Tennant, Roman Polanski's business manager. No, neither she nor Bill had heard from Sharon since late the previous afternoon. At that time, Sharon had said that she, Gibby, Abigail Folger, and Wojtek Frykowski were staying in that night. Jay had said he'd be dropping over later, and she invited Sandy to join him. Jay had said that he'd be dropping over later, and she invited Sandy to join them. No party was planned, just a quiet evening at home. Now, this is different from the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood movie where they went out to a restaurant. Sharon Tate was talking about that dirty movie being shown down the street at the theater as though a regular movie and all that kind of stuff. So that's movie symbolism hinting at what is going on at the house. But that's only if you put these 2 scenes together in your mind later, at some point after watching the movie and having read this book. So how often does that happen, that people who read this book watch that movie? Often enough, I suppose, but probably not often enough for anyone to put 2 and 2 together, right? Symbolically speaking, a sink placed in the various forms of media at different times, right? Sandy, just over the chickenpox, had declined. Like Mrs. Tate, she had tried to call Sharon that morning, but had received no answer. Sandy assured Mrs. Tate that there was probably no connection between the report of the fire and 10050 Cielo Drive. However, just as soon as Mrs. Tate hung up, Sandy put in a call to her husband's tennis club and had him paged. It was important, she said. Sometime between 10 and, tennis club. That seems to me to be kind of an intelligence symbol. Military intelligence symbol. A tennis racket shows up in the movie. Gosh, what is it? The Robert Redford movie from 1975. About, the CIA in New York City. I can't remember the title right now, but as a symbol, it's a weapon you can keep in your office, even if you're not allowed to have weapons there, right? You could seriously mess somebody up with a tennis racket. It's kind of like an axe and a sword. You put somebody's voice box out with that thing pretty easily, just with a jab with the end of one of those things. Sometime between 10 and 11 a.m., Raymond Kilgore, a telephone company representative, climbed the pole outside the gate to 10050 Cielo Drive and found that 4 phone wires had been cut. The cuts were close to the attachment on the pole. It also was outside the gate. So that makes it likely that Tex Watson's story could be true. Maybe he did climb up there and cut those wires. So their inside man would simply have probably left. Or maybe he was made to leave with the group, but that's unlikely to. The smaller a group you have moving around, the less noticeable you are. So supposedly that night they had 4 people walking up that street. Yeah. 4. Yeah, they had stated that, people typically wanted to go along for the ride for this murder night thing. And it's like, no, we've got enough people. Yeah, if you got 5 people walking up the road, that definitely attracts attention. I'm thinking in military terms here, but usually if you want to avoid attracting attention, you keep it to 3 or less people, 3 or fewer people. And try not to move as though you're moving together, right? So people don't take notice of you. 4 people suddenly show up, and that's a military unit. That's a typical military unit that a sniper could zero in on, right? Who happens to be watching the area, and you didn't pick up on the sniper location ahead of time, or maybe you're close to the edge of a city that's under siege, and you're walking around as a group of 4, and a sniper zeroes you. Or artillery, a spotter for artillery zeroes you, right? As likely a military unit walking around, resistors or whatever. Indicating that the person responsible had probably climbed the pole to Kilgore, repaired 2 of the wires, leaving the others for the detectives to examine. Interesting. Telephone company representative. Okay, that was thoughtful of him. 2 were repaired. What could that... I'm constantly looking for symbols here, right? Sometimes every now and then I overreach, but I'm actually getting pretty good at this. Police cars were arriving every few minutes now, and as more officers visited the scene changed. The horn-rimmed glasses, first observed by DeRosa, Weisenhunt, and Burbridge near the 2 trunks. Yeah, the glasses are kind of a Capricorn symbol. It's considered to be nerdy because you shouldn't need glasses unless there's something going on with you characterologically, right? If you don't have a congenital problem, they would deem you to be suffering either from injury, but if no injury is obvious, it's probably characterological in the sense that you're neurotic somehow and can't see straight. That's the way these people think on the subject. So glasses are like a phallic Capricorn symbol, but also a masking symbol. The little infant is fascinated by the glasses, puts the glasses on like the adults do, that sort of thing. Plays with it like it, plays with the glasses as though they're a mask or something, a Halloween mask. But they're left over by the trunks. One trunk is leaning against the other trunks. We don't know why these trunks were tipped over. Well, we don't know exactly why. For sure, right? But, it could be a sex symbol. The glasses symbolizing the same thing as the gun grips left by the front door. The knife left in the chair. The bunny left on the headboard. Could be identifying various locations where sexual activities were filmed. You never know about these things. Sperm is another Capricorn symbol, as things left near entryways on film even, right? So, they could be media genre symbols as well as any other kind of symbol related to Capricorn. The horn-rimmed glasses first observed by DeRosa, Weisenhunt, and Burbridge near the two trunks had somehow moved 6 feet away to the top of the desk. Yeah. Again, that's an implausibility. That's potentially evidence, you don't touch anything in a crime scene area. Period. That's my thinking as, a lay person. So, 2 pieces of gun grip, first seen near the entryway, were now under a chair in the living room. Okay, that symbolizes sperm, making their way towards heaven, I guess you could say, or some form or another of ultimate fate, right? There's an ultimate location where these things wind up like, dead sperm cells making their way towards the fallopian tube, whatever. This fallopian tube swim team at work or whatever. As stated in the official LAPD report, they were apparently kicked under the chair by one of the original officers on the scene. However, no one is copping out. Yeah, copping out. There's all kinds of little loaded language phrases in here. There are all kinds of them. A third piece of gun grip, smaller than the others, was later found on the front porch. Yeah, it's a vagina symbol, okay, at the front door. There's a light typically up there. That's a clitoris symbol, carriage light or whatever. And one or more officers tracked blood from inside the residence onto the front porch and walk, adding several more bloody footprints to those already there. In an attempt to identify and eliminate the later additions, it would be necessary to interview all the personnel who had visited the scene, asking each if he had been wearing boots, shoes with smooth or rippled soles, and so on. This is, to me, is GOAT Network activity. Okay, just chaos on the scene, right? The same thing went down with John Benet Ramsey's murder scene situation in Boulder. Supposedly, they weren't accustomed to dealing with murderers in Boulder, but that's just lore, right? These are trained professionals, for crying out loud. Even though it's in the late 60s, but still, I mean, come on. They had forensics back then, so they could read fingerprints, take fingerprints. They could do all of that stuff. Granado was still taking blood samples. Later in the police lab, he would give them the Oshterlony test to determine if the blood was animal or human. If human, other tests would be applied to determine the blood type, A, B, or O, and the subtype. There are some 30 blood types. However, if the blood is already dry when the sample is taken, it is only possible to determine whether it is one of 3, MN or MN. It had been a warm night, and it was already turning into another hot day. By the time Granado got to work, most of the blood, except for the pools near the bodies inside, had already dried. Yeah, in my view, it was pig's blood in the living room, at the very least. They might have had to paint up Abigail Folger outside. So I'm convinced, though, Wojtek Frykowski was a target for murder, though. That autopsy photograph of him has got a lot of convincing items associated with it. And the same with Stephen Parent. I don't specifically remember Abigail Folger's autopsy photographs, whether or not they even exist. I got to go look them up again. Within the next several days, Granado would obtain from the coroner's office a blood sample from each of the victims and would attempt to match these with the samples he'd already collected. In an ordinary murder case, the presence of 2 blood types at the crime scene might indicate that the killer, as well as the victim, had been wounded. information which could be an important clue to the killer's identity. But this was no ordinary murder. Instead of one body, there were 5. There was so much blood, in fact, that Granado overlooked some spots. On the right side of the front porch, as approached from the walk, there were several large pools of blood. Granado took a sample from only one spot, presuming, he later said, all were the same. Presuming. Okay, again, that's an implausibility. Goat networking at work here, right? They got such extensive control over this police organization. They can control every individual that accesses this site from any organization accessing it, right? I don't believe that was the case at the time in San Francisco. Just to the right of the porch, the shrubbery appeared broken, as if someone had fallen into the bushes. Blood spatters were seen to bear this out. Granado missed these. Nor did he take samples from the pools of blood in the immediate vicinity of the 2 bodies in the living room. Samples from the pools of blood in the immediate vicinity of the 2 bodies in the living room, or from the stains near the 2 bodies on the lawn. Presuming, he'd later testified that they belonged to the nearest victims, and he'd be getting samples from the coroner anyway. Yeah, that's an implausibility again. Goat networking, in my view. These are professionals, for crying out loud. Man, you take the samples and mark them. Sort them out later when you get back to the office, but make sure you do a good job of taking samples, okay, measuring data. All right, you do that in accordance with protocol. It should be automatic. Maybe he has limited resources on hand, though. That's something to take into consideration. Just like a combat medic has limited access to medical supplies in a mass casualty situation, you have to allocate those supplies carefully. You want to maximize the number of lives you save, the number of limbs you save, and the eyesight that you save, right? However, for some reason never explained, he didn't run subtypes on 21 of them. Again, goat networking, right? I mean, it's like, this guy know his job or what? Oh, he's going to get away with it. He's working with other goats. Plenty of them. However, for some reason never explained, he didn't run subtypes on 21 of them. If this is not done a week or 2 after collection, the components of the blood break down. Later, when an attempt was made to recreate the murders, the omissions would cause many problems. Again, chaos reproduces, right? Just like in combat, you keep all your ducks in a row and your P's and Q's straight ahead of time to, minimize, or at least delay the onset of chaos as far as your own involvement in combat is concerned, right? You hope the enemy winds up in a chaotic state first, right? As soon as you're in a chaotic state, you are losing on some level or another. You hope your enemy is losing worse than you are, all right? Just before noon, William Tennant arrived, still dressed in tennis clothes, and was escorted through the gate by the police. It was like being led through a nightmare, as he was taken first to one body, then another. He didn't recognize the young man in the automobile, but he identified the man on the lawn as Wojtek Frykowski. William Tennant arrived, still dressed in tennis clothes. William Tennant, who? Okay, somebody who knew them. The woman as Abigail Folger, and the 2 bodies in the living room as Sharon Tate Polanski and tentatively Jay Sebring. When the police lifted the bloody towel, the man's face was badly contused. Tenement couldn't be sure. Then he went outside and was sick. When the police photographer finished his work, another officer got sheets from the linen closet and covered the bodies. Beyond the gate, the reporters and photographers now numbered in the dozens, with more arriving every few minutes. Police and press cars so hopelessly jammed Cielo Drive that several officers were detailed to try and untangle them. As Tennant pushed through the crowd, clutching his stomach and sobbing, the reporters hurled questions at him. Is Sharon Tate dead? Were they murdered? Has anyone informed Roman Polanski? He ignored them, but they read the answers on his face. Not everyone who... Yeah, Yeah, they would have had to... If they set this thing up as a fake murder... It's like in the early morning hours before the arrival of the press, right? And during the time when you actually have control over the scene, control that access onto the site, right? Network people only, brought into the scene, okay? They can even do kind of an acting job out on the front lawn, as terrible as that sounds for me to say, as though I'm like some kind of ultimate asshole talking on the internet, right? But it's an idea that has to be considered at the very least, right? The possibility of... Not everyone who visited the scene was as reluctant to talk. It's like a battlefield up there, Police Sergeant Stanley Clorman told reporters, his gestures grim with the shock of what he had seen. It's like a battlefield up there. Okay, that's coded tell, okay, in my view. If this officer is an inside person, right, involved in managing the scene, they'll drop little hints of a symbolic nature. They get themselves into the story, and these are intelligence operatives at work, enjoying their craft on a certain level, because they know at least a number of these deaths were fake. Maybe if somebody actually was killed, he would consider it to have been for good reason, whether he knew what that reason was or not. Another officer, unidentified, said, it looked ritualistic. Another tell, right? Anything can be ritual, okay? If there's procedure involved, you can turn it into quote-unquote ritual, okay? That's the way these people handle the idea of ritual. Okay, satanic ritual, it's cover. There's no reason to, what do they say, blood? Some of the terminology used to describe drinking blood from infants and all that kind of crap. Nobody in their right mind does that for a number of obvious reasons. It's severely unhealthy for one thing. There's no benefit for it. The type of vampirism they practice is way more effective than drawing vital energies from the blood of a dead person. Yeah. What do they call it? Blood cooking, all kinds of weird terminology. Cooking, okay, that's a code word, okay, for ritual. Blood ritual, in other words, right? Yeah, but who does that kind of crap? It's symbolism, sure. What kind of symbolism do you want associated with your life, if you have any kind of a right mind at all, even as an organized criminal? I don't think you want to be bathing in people's blood. They made the infant, I guess, probably walk down that hill covered in blood, for all I know. But, yeah, that's the only blood bathing going on, or spirit cooking, I think they call it. Yeah, that's the terminology. Cooking, ritual, spirit ritual. Now, spirit ritual is kind of a different deal depending on what kind of ritual you're doing, right? Yeah, these people do appreciate the idea of being spirited in life, okay? It's part of what makes them establishment people. But they don't do stupid things, Something like murder is something that they would manage very carefully, all right? They would pride themselves to an appropriate degree, in their view, on being, no more involved in nasty activities than absolutely necessary, right? There is such a thing as karma, in my view. They would probably think the same way I'm thinking on the subject right now. Karma. Something to manage, like the booze managed in the movie Eyes Wide Shut. Just a huge collection of booze bottles kept on a table in a game room. You share a little bit of it with people every once in a while, and a small amount of it is considered beneficial because it greases the wheels of social interaction or whatever. But you don't leave the place drunk if you have any sense at all, right? So not everyone who visited the scene was as reluctant to talk. It's like a battlefield up there. Police Sergeant Stanley Clorman told reporters, his features grim with the shock of what he had seen. Another officer, unidentified, said, It looked ritualistic. Okay, that's the kind of thing that sets reporters off, man. They could print for days on that statement right there. You really get people hung up over this idea of ritual going on up there. It's the Satan people again, right? This single remark providing the basis for an incredible amount of bizarre speculation. Exactly what they need. Chaos. Bizarre speculation. If you're going to speculate, it makes sense to be systematic about it. You can take a matter-of-factual orientation on that subject and be very scientific about it, but this also happens to be something that is being imposed upon people out of communist sympathetic quarters, right? Social circles. Or you could take, like I do, to be effective, quite effective on this level of speculating, is to make use of the secret tree of alchemy, which I happen to know is a map, a mind reality map that these people make extensive use of on a secret level, a secret networking level, right? So certainly the GOAT networkers would be making use of it in their own fashion, right? Like the shock waves from an earthquake, news of the murders spread. 5 slain in Bel Air, read the headline on the first AP Wire story. Though sent out before the identity of the victims had become known, it correctly reported the locations of the bodies, that the telephone lines had been cut, and the arrest of an unnamed suspect. There were errors. One to be much repeated, that one victim had a hood over his head. A towel. That would be the towel. Yeah, according to Miles Mathis, that was there because Jay Sebring was not an actor who could act dead. He didn't say anything along those lines with the other two out on the lawn, though. And after accessing the photographs in this book, I'm convinced again that both of those people probably did die out on that lawn. These people sometimes do commit network suicide too, for whatever reason. Maybe they just want to start over again. New reincarnation kind of a deal. They think in terms of reincarnation. And apparently they are convinced for whatever reason, about the reality of reincarnation. LAPD notified the Tates, John Madden, who in turn notified Sebring's parents, and Peter Folger, Abigail's father. Now, Peter Folger spent decades after this murder keeping his daughter's name out of print as much as possible. Okay? Which could indicate a number of things, as I've mentioned before, right? That would be Peter Folger, which Peter is kind of a Capricorn name along phallic lines, and coffee happens to be too. Okay? These people act as though coffee is a toxin of some kind that you're consuming. As though, in my view, classic singles, Folger's classic singles in the little bags, you get 19 of them in a box, as though to say, well, this is a recommended dose for a month. When you get paid at the beginning of the month, you only need 1 box for one person during the course of a month. Any more than this might be a bad idea. Don't drink it every day. Drink it maybe every other day. But you can have 2 cups on the weekend for one day on the weekend, whichever weekend day you're drinking coffee. You can have 2 cups on that day. But make sure you don't drink it every day, right? And usually no more than 1. Abigail's socially prominent parents were divorced. Her father, chairman of the board of the A.J. Folger Coffee Company, lived in Woodside. Her mother, Inez Mejia, Mijia Folger, in San Francisco. Yeah, the coffee company originated in San Francisco. According to some people, it was supposedly sold off to a corporate entity prior to these murders, but I don't consider that individual to be fully reliable. Useful sometimes, mostly in trying to get some kind of a mind map together regarding what the heck exists exactly in Southern and Northern California. Beyond that, well, maybe even on that level, in my view, he's quite suspect, okay? Has a network involved for reasons he's even stated himself, but I won't get into the details of that. Yeah, these people exist on the internet. They're on the web forums too. Chaos, right? They crawl out of the woodwork somehow. But however, Mrs. Folger was not at home but in Connecticut visiting friends following a Mediterranean cruise, and Mr. Folger reached her there. She couldn't believe it. She had talked to Abigail at about 10 the previous night. Both mother and daughter had planned to fly to San Francisco today for a reunion. Abigail having made a reservation on a 10 a.m. United flight. United. Mother and daughter coming together. Interesting, but could be coincidence. Yeah. On reaching home, William Tennant made what was for him the most difficult call. He was not only Polanski's business manager, but a close friend. Tennant checked his watch, automatically adding 9 hours to get London time. 9 hours, that's interesting. Yeah. Though it would be late in the evening, he guessed that Polanski might still be working, trying to tie up his various film projects before returning home the following Tuesday. He tried the number of his own house. He guessed right. Polanski and several associates were going over a scene in the script of The Day of the Dolphin when the telephone rang down. That movie is supposedly about training a dolphin to become an assassin. So what are they doing with the infant JSK MK Ultra wise? Who's he supposed to be, Manchurian candidate wise, right? Certainly assassinating himself probably over the course of his life, they would expect, right? But these training things could involve any number of things that are like assassination, but aren't really dangerous per se, right? But he did have toy guns that, according to some thinking, he even had with him on the night of the murder for security reasons, almost like a security blanket, almost. The way kids are, the way they play as though they're playing for real, maybe even when they're stressed somehow. You don't have a little dolly, you got your cap gun. Conditioning, right? That's speculative, highly speculative on my part. But Polanski would remember the conversation as follows. Roman, there's been a disaster in a house. Which house? Your house. Oh, that's a little weird. In a house. A house. That's interesting. That could be a tale written into the book of some kind, right? Because the author of this book and the co-author writing together, Netwrok people, could include all kinds of information in here, and some of these people have people co-writing with them these books, even professional writers. I believe Chaos was written with a co-writer. Maybe, for organizational reasons, because there's so much information to go over. So, me being suspicious along those lines, kind of shaky maybe, but something to take into consideration, being a quote-unquote asshole or whatever. But when you're doing these kinds of investigations, it's like you are some kind of an asshole as part of the task, right? You have to say the unpleasant things, or at least take these ideas into consideration out in the open air, so to speak, so that things can be aired out in the public thought process, right? In the public mind at large. This is the way people should be, in my view, though. But it's something to handle responsibly. You don't prosecute over these kinds of speculations, right? There's a legal process used for prosecuting criminals or alleged criminals who are considered, innocent until proven guilty, right, in a court of law. Being a legal court, that's a serious matter, right? Because the idea of being sound and true becomes particularly important there, or effectively you could be murdering people and torturing people for no good reason. And even, this torture aspect of the whole thing. I mean, being in prison automatically is a torture, but you don't make it more of a torture to the point where you're practicing the torturing arts and becoming corrupt in the process, right? What you do, you become. That way, for example, if you're working corrections, I mean, your behavior becomes so important on that level. You could become sadomasochistic as a personality at the speed of light working corrections if you don't watch your behavior and temper yourself appropriately to be thoroughly professional under those conditions, right? At all times, on guard, not only of what you're expected to guard over, but your own behavior. Your house. Then in a rush, Sharon is dead and Wojtek and Gabby and Jay. No. Surely there was a mistake. Both men now crying. Tennant reiterated that it was true. He had gone to the house himself. How? Clancy asked. He was thinking. He later said, not a fire, but a landslide, or a not uncommon thing in the Los Angeles hills, especially after heavy rains. Sometimes whole houses were buried, which meant that perhaps they could still be alive. Only then did Tennant tell him that they had been murdered. Wojtek Frykowski, the LAPD learned, had a son in Poland, but no relatives in the United States. The youth in the Rambler remained unidentified, but was no longer nameless. He had been designated as John Doe 85. The news spread quickly, and with it, the rumors. 85 adds up to 13, adds up to 4. That could be significant there. But then, of course, it's a random number assigned to. I guess I don't know what the context for is that as far as timeline is concerned, right? The news spread quickly, and with it the rumors. Rudy Altobelli, owner of the Cielo property and business manager for a number of show business personalities, was in Rome. One of his clients, that's a vacay city right there. Expensive. And he keeps you out of the area while they run their intelligence operations, right? One of his clients, a young actress, called and told him that Sharon and 4 others had been murdered in his house, and that Gerritsen, the caretaker he had hired, had confessed. Whoa, that's pretty. One of his clients, the young actress, called and told him that Sharon and 4 others had been murdered in his house, and that Gerritsen, the caretaker he had hired, had confessed. Whoa, that is something to slam somebody over the head with, misinformation-wise, right? Yeah, you would. Well, in a real situation, you'd be pretty guilty, emotionally very guilty right off the bat. So you'd feel that way, but we don't know if this is a true situation or not. These are accounts, right? Intelligence networks have a capacity to do that. They can get all their P's and Q's together as a network and then produce, like precipitating from out of that hidden network perspective, all the accounts associated with their involvements in this situation, right? Making sure everything lines up properly. And if there's any confusion, it's no big deal. This can be written off as typical of witness accounts or other accounts of involvement, right? Because people are unreliable, at the very least, if not outright liars, and on a large scale. The way memory actually works, for example, with faces, it's an automatic thing. You'll instantly recognize people very accurately when it just happens for you. But when you're trying to recognize somebody that you supposedly saw, you run into problems. Or if you're trying to remember what you saw exactly. Nature, on an evolutionary scale, doesn't necessarily value very much that particular take on remembering things. But you bloody well better be able to recognize an animal shape from a good distance, or the shape of another human being, the shape of body parts of a person, the face. Recognize instantly, facial features, even from a distance. Okay? That's how we evolved. To remember things that are potentially a threat. Okay, that's just human nature. It's built into the brain. It's wired in. You have what's known as a fusiform face area on the bottom part of your brain that instantly recognizes a human face, right? And you have the capacity to remember identity, being socially evolved as a human being, right? But when you try to remember somebody at a police lineup, for example, you run into problems. It's not an automatic thing for you. You're not reliable in your memory at that point necessarily, unless you happen to be good that way. And you're under pressure, right? Just like I'm under pressure right now talking into this microphone. You know, I kind of waver in and out of being effective in my communications until I get used to this thing, right? Develop a knack for making use of this kind of communications modality. Garrison hadn't, but Altobelli would not learn this until after he returned to the United States. Whoa, that would be something to carry as a weight. This would make people automatically apprehensive about questioning him too much, maybe, on an emotional level. You know, just in case somebody outside the network were to question him. Maybe, I don't know. For sure. The specialists had begun arriving about noon. Officers Jerome A. Bowen and D.L. Girt, G-I-R-T, Latent Prints Section, Scientific Investigation Division, LAPD, dusted the main residence and the guest house for prints. After dusting a print with powder, developing the print, a clear adhesive tape was placed over it. The tape with the print showing would be lifted and placed on a card with a contrasting background. Location, date, time, officer's initials were noted on the back. One such lift card prepared by Bowen read 8-9-69-10050 Cielo /1400 /J, capital J, capital A, capital B, /inside door frame of the left French door / from master bedroom to pool area / handle side. See, that's protocol right there. Somebody's following protocol. Another lift taken about the same time was from the outside front door, or quote, outside front door / handle side / above handle, unquote. It took 6 hours to cover both residences. Later that, 6 could be symbolic, but maybe reaching on that particular interpretation, maybe. Unless things come together as I read further on, but I don't think that's going to happen with that. Later, things have a tendency to consolidate into an understanding, right? The right side of your brain at work, connecting dots, Okay, your brain has capacity to do that for you to a degree. That's why sometimes when you wake up in the morning, your dots suddenly, for some issue that you were worrying over yesterday, are all connected together, and it feels so much better, right? It's like closure has been achieved, even on a minor level over some issue where you got it resolved. And you might not even be aware of the process of absolution at work in supplementing your resolve and trying to solve that problem, right? Thus, when you wake up in the morning, things seem to have resolved themselves. Wow, serendipity, maybe, in your mind. Who knows? You think it's luck or whatever, or it's true what they say. Sometimes you should just sleep on it. But the right side of your brain does a lot of that dot connecting, right? The vampires love to hit you on the right side of the brain. That's where you bring chaos into people's lives. Even well-spoken people can be thoroughly chaotic otherwise, right? So you constantly got to work on solving them puzzles, and the vampires will come after you with quote-unquote puzzle solvers, because places where you like to go sometimes have puzzles set out on tables to get the point across. There's a puzzle solver here. He gets to take loot from you, a portion of it, and then he practices solving puzzles so he can hold on to those memories, right? Or she, There's a method for working puzzles efficiently. They know the method, and they practice, but there's a certain amount of combined resolve and absolution at work when you're working puzzles, right? Exercising the right side of your brain that way. On one level, you could consider that to be kind of a waste of time, though, compared with even doing a real crime investigation from an armchair perspective. So you don't want to dedicate your life to something like that. So unless you're making a lot of money, I suppose, a good living doing it, but you don't want to add to the chaos out there, right, in the world on a subject like this, an important subject, if you can avoid it. Disinformation being a form of chaos brought to bear on people, along with whatever misinformation that can be taken advantage of in doing so. That's already floating around out there. It took 6 hours to cover both residences. Later that afternoon, the pair were joined by Officer D.E. Dorman and Wendell Clemens, later a civilian fingerprint expert who concentrated on the 4 vehicles. Contrary to popular opinion, a readable print is far more than common. Contrary to popular opinion, see, I'm even reading this wrong. Apparently, I share the popular opinion. Contrary to popular opinion, a readable print is far more rare than common. Many surfaces, such as clothing and fabrics, do not lend themselves to impressions. Even when the surface is such that it will take a print, one usually touches it with only a portion of the finger, leaving a fragmentary ridge, which is useless for comparison. If the finger is moved, the result is an unreadable smudge. And as Officer DeRosa demonstrated with the gate button, one print placed atop another creates a superimposure, also useless for identification purposes. Thus, at any crime scene, the number of clear, readable prints with enough points for comparison is usually surprisingly small. Not counting those prints later eliminated as belonging to LAPD personnel at the scene, a total of 50 lists were taken from the residence, guest house, and vehicles at 10050 Cielo Drive. That could be symbolic along the lines of Leo or paw print kind of a deal, maybe. See, there's symbolism at work here with just the addresses. Like Cielo Drive adds up to 6, but 50 is on the end of it there, right? 1 to 5, symbolizing intelligence on that level, suggesting Gemini, but more strongly suggesting Virgo, which is movie star symbolism, right? But also an intelligence symbol, because when they terraced out all these properties, right, they would have chosen these numbers symbolically. See, that's an address number that I do pay attention to. I don't pay attention too much to every last address that comes along in these readings, right? But this address and the house next door definitely would be symbolically significant together. And maybe somebody like Sharon Tate picks up on that, or maybe not. But somebody like Stephen Parent, not as likely. He might not even be clued in at all on something like the Secretary of Alchemy. Whether movie stars are across the board or not, it's hard to say. I would imagine they are, though, considering they're so deeply involved in media work, and likely had to be compromised blackmail-wise just to get into that position of being established on that level. Of these, 7 were eliminated as belonging to William Garretson. All were from the guest house. None of Garretson's prints were found in the main house or on the vehicles. An additional 15 were eliminated as belonging to the victims, and 3 were not clear enough for comparison. This left a total of 25 unmatched latent prints, any of which might or might not belong to the killer or killers. It was 1:30 p.m. before the first homicide detectives arrived. On verifying that the deaths were not accidental or self-inflicted, Lieutenant Madlock had requested that the investigation be reassigned to Robbery Homicide Division. Lieutenant Robert J. Helder, Supervisor of Investigations, was placed in charge. He in turn assigned Sergeants Michael J. McCain and Jess Buckles to the case. Jess Buckles, McCann. Yeah, you can't make every name symbolic, right? But at certain points, this seems to happen, which is interesting. The way intelligence networks can arrange things, but not all the time, along those lines. McCann's regular partner, Sergeant Robert Calkins, was on vacation and would replace Buckles when he returned. Now that is interesting. That kind of thing went on with Jack the Ripper too, but I suppose it happens all the time too. 3 additional officers, Sergeants E. Henderson, Dudley Varney, and Danny Galindo, were to assist them. On being notified of the homicide's Los Angeles County coroner, Thomas Noguchi asked the police not to touch the bodies until the representative of his office had examined them. Deputy Coroner John Finken arrived about 1:45 later to be joined by Noguchi himself. Finken made the official determination of death. Took liver and environmental temperatures. By 2 p.m. it was 94 degrees on the lawn, 83 degrees inside the house, and severed the rope connecting Tate and Sebring, portions of which were given to the detectives so they could try to determine where it had been manufactured and sold. It was white, 3-strand nylon. Its total length, 43 feet 8 inches. That could be symbolic. Libra followed by Scorpio. Yeah, sitting in a tree, so to speak, right? Hanged men together. So they do a symbolic, sometimes you'll see them do this too in movies where they take a fall, but then they'll cross their legs like the hanged man to symbolize death rather than actually maybe suffering. It's kind of like a ward. If you're going to fake a death, you might put symbolic cues into the situation along those lines, right? Yeah, they put like Abigail Folger died near a drain. That could be symbolically significant, where Libra is draining down into pure oblivion. She died out there. Dying is a Capricorn analogy. Being completely dead and 6 feet under. That's Aries symbolism. 6 feet under in the darkness. The fall of the Soviet Union was fake, and it was symbolic at the same time. Stuff like that. Granado took blood samples from the rope, but didn't take subtypes, again presuming Finken also removed the personal property from the bodies of the victims. Sharon Tate, Polanski, yellow metal wedding band, earrings, Jay Sebring, Cartier wristwatch, later determined to be worth in excess of $1,500. John Doe 85, Lucerne wristwatch, wallet with various papers but no ID. Abigail Folger and Wojtek Frykowski, no property on persons. After plastic bags had been placed over the hands of the victims to preserve any hair or skin that might have become lodged under the nails during a struggle, Finken assisted in covering and placing the bodies on stretcher carts to be wheeled to ambulances and taken to the coroner's office, Hall of Justice, downtown Los Angeles. Besieged by reporters at the gate, Dr. Noguchi announced he would have no comment until making public the autopsy results at noon the following day. Both Noguchi and Finken, however, privately had already given the detectives their initial findings. There was no evidence of sexual molestation or mutilation. 3 of the victims, John Doe, Sebring, and Frykowski, had been shot. Aside from a defensive slash wound on his left hand, which also severed the band of his wristwatch, yeah, that could be symbolic, but it's hard to say in that situation. John Doe had not been stabbed, but the other 4 had many, many times. In addition, Sebring had been hit in the face at least once, and Frykowski had been struck over the head repeatedly with a blunt object. Though exact findings would have to await the autopsies, the coroners concluded from the size of the bullet holes that the gun used had probably been a .22 caliber. The police had already suspected this, and searching the Rambler, Sergeant Varney had found 4 bullet fragments between the upholstery and the exterior metal of the door on the passenger side. Also found on the cushion of the rear seat was part of a slug. Though all were too small for comparison purposes, they appeared to be .22 caliber. As for the stab wound, someone suggested that the wound pattern was not dissimilar to that made by a bayonet. Now, some people are claiming that it had to be an M7 bayonet. Of course, there were variations of bayonet that used that same blade shape going all the way back to World War II. So it could have been anything from an M1 bayonet to the M7, outside chance, more likely the buck knives that were, presented as evidence in the court trial, right? Supposedly the Manson family had all been effectively issued folding buck knives, pretty good sized knives too. I don't know how precise a science knife wound patterns are exactly. Stab wounds. To me, you got issues like tissue that swells up immediately upon being stabbed. Swelling starts to take place. Inflammation issues, basically, that could cloud the whole issue of what kind of knife was used. You'd be looking for like cut patterns on both ends of the wounds, I would imagine, to try and determine if it was a bayonet. And something like an M7 bayonet's not that much different from a knife blade. It's a thin bayonet blade. Okay, it was designed that way to preserve strategic metal resources. The military, back when they were trying to build huge battleships, and they needed all the steel they could get, and they put the entire industry, they strained an entire national scale industry over that issue of building those ships, right? So they're trying to figure out how to bring, make bayonets more efficient, smaller in size, because the M1 bayonet at the beginning of World War II was a pretty good sized bayonet. It's a long blade, almost like a short sword blade, right? So they made it like the M3 fighting knife blade. I think that's what they adopted for the efficient bayonets they came up with, right? Which happened to be ideal to put on the end of an M16 rifle. But these were not M16 rifle rounds that were found inside the Rambler, okay? M16 rifle rounds are like, even though they're 22 caliber rounds, they're heavier, a bit, maybe 10 to 15 grains heavier typically, not always heavier, but they're fired at way higher velocities. They're basically high-powered rifle velocity rounds compared with a 22 long rifle. Okay, those rounds would go all the way through the car door, okay, and they can cause really ghastly wounds in the body, to include, exit wounds, far more ghastly than what you get with a 22 caliber long rifle bullet, depending on, how those high velocity bullets pass through the body. Okay, you get a stretch cavity right away, followed by a wound cavity left behind. Exit wounds can be very significantly larger than the entry wounds, or maybe only just a little larger. And sometimes a bullet will tumble inside the body and then exit someplace unexpected, which those rifles, back in the day in Vietnam, for example, the first M16's rifles developed a reputation for such wounds that were just ghastly, okay? According to the evidence presented in this book, they were not M16 rifle bullets by a long shot, okay? And M16s are going to be louder than a 22 long rifle. A 22 long rifle bullet fired from a pistol probably doesn't even make a sonic crack. It'll make like a firecracker sounding bullet fired from a gun noise that people can be more likely confused over, compared with that was definitely a high-powered rifle. And, people would have been waking up all over the neighborhood beyond any shadow of a doubt, right? It makes kind of a characteristic crack sound, too. It's high-velocity crack sound. The M16 firing its ammunition compared with something like a 30 caliber, also a high-velocity, high-powered rifle round, but the sounds are a little bit different. In their official report, the detectives carried this a step further, concluding the knife that inflicted the stab wounds was probably a bayonet. Now, this could be goat networking activity at work here, because they know this is the kind of thing that people can become confused over, thinking, it was military people that were up there, right? More like, a certain kind of military intelligence presence, but supposedly Tex Watson did make use of a bayonet at the, according to the evidence in the court cases, an M1 bayonet, likely, one of the ones I was talking about at the La Bianca murder, okay, including the little sash cord that comes with the bayonet scabbard. This not only eliminated a number of other possibilities, it also presumed that only one knife had been used. The depth of the wounds, many in excess of 5 inches, their width between 1 and 1.5 inches, and their thickness, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch, ruled out either a kitchen or a regular pocket knife. Interesting. Regular pocket knife. He's talking about an EDC carry type pocket knife. These knives were a bit larger and were carried in like little pouches that came with the knife, I believe. Typically, they'd be walking around Spawn Ranch with the things on their belts and stuff. Yeah, it's a good sized knife. If you look at the picture in the book, the knife left in the chair. Coincidentally, the only two knives found in the house were a kitchen knife and a pocket knife. Thing is, you can make a deep stab wound with even a small knife, depending on where you stab them. Deeper than the blade length, just because you're kind of like punching into them while stabbing them sometimes. Yeah, punch somebody in the gut with a knife in your hand and make like a 4-inch deep cut, maybe with, well, it's measured as maybe 4 inches deep, though the blade is only like 2 3/4 inches or something like that. So a steak knife had been found in the kitchen sink. This could also be the authors, spreading disinformation too, but it's hard to say. Goat networking at work here. And at the very least, they're maybe overemphasizing this idea of it being a bayonet just because they know what the press is going to do with the idea. Though they could have been perfectly truthful in what they were saying. Maybe they should have maybe kept that under wraps initially, at least. At least allow people to develop a mind map in their collective mind as to what was going on up there prior to releasing that specific information, so that people don't become hysterical and hysterically speculative at the same time, right? Just kind of control the flow of information so people have a broad idea of what was going on up there ahead of time before they get a hold of that specific information. But these people are talking about bayonets right off the bat, right? Ritual, they talk ritual, and it looks like a war zone in there or whatever. A steak knife had been found in the kitchen sink. Granado got a positive benzidine reaction indicating blood, but a negative Ochroloni indicating it was animal, not human. Whoa. Okay, blood in the kitchen. Ochroloni, Ouchterlony, the O capitalized. Bowen dusted it for prints, but got only fragmentary ridges. Mrs. Chapman later identified the knife as one of a set of steak knives that belonged to the Polanskis, and she located all the others in a drawer. But even before this, the police had eliminated it because of its dimensions, in particular its thinness. Stabbings were so savage that such a blade would have broken. The thing is, right, if they use bayonets, right, they would have to take the weapons with them away from the scene. They took the pistol away from the scene and threw it into a large property's backyard area for some kid to find later on. Again, that's like an ejaculation symbolism at work there, right? The gun has an ultimate fate, I guess you could say. Granado found the second knife in the living room, less than 3 feet from Sharon Tate's body. It was wedged behind the cushion in one of the chairs with the blade sticking up. Now, I believe Susan Atkins claimed that she lost her knife or something like that. And thus Tex Watson had to do the murder or something like that. I got to read up on that again. Later accounts of the murders as published. A Buck brand clasp type pocket knife. Its blade was 3/4 inch in diameter and 3 13/16 inches long, so it's almost a 4-inch blade, making it too small to have caused most of the wounds. Noticing a spot on the side of the blade. Now, this is not an issue that came up in Chaos reading through that book. I noticed this issue that this blade could not have been one of the blades used. That rule out never showed up in Chaos, which makes you wonder, right? Granado tested it for blood, negative. Gert dusted it for prints, an unreadable smudge. A single unreadable smudge. That is interesting. They would have wiped the blade down and put a smudge on it for them to find. maybe. Yeah, if it were Susan Atkins' knife that she somehow dropped or tossed aside accidentally, there would have been smudges all over it, I would imagine, her fingerprints. So the knife was planted, in my view, all right, for them to find. Mrs. Chapman could not recall ever having seen this particular knife. This plus the odd place where it was found indicated that it might have been left by the killers, in my view, deliberately. Just same as the bunny symbol in the bedroom, right? Maybe they noticed that Abigail Folger had that bunny sitting up there, and then they decided to play symbolic games with one of their knives. Or Tex Watson could have had a bayonet up there with him, maybe the same M1 bayonet that he used at the other murder site, for the murder that took place the following day. In literature, a murder scene is often likened to a picture puzzle. Here we go with the puzzle analogy, right? This is where inductive reasoning comes to play. If one is patient and keeps trying, eventually all the pieces will fit into place, right? And you can, I guess, get good at putting puzzles together, right? Even those little game puzzles they like to play symbolic games with, along with Scrabble boards left out to be seen, right? See, people, rather annoyingly, tend to be sadistic along these lines, too often in my view. Okay, it indicates that civilization isn't sound and genuine as people claim it is. Abrahamic civilization, for example, is loaded with sadomasochism. Okay, it's amplified and enhanced and part of the repression mechanism at work in people's lives. So when people open up with a sadism, they tend to be particularly malicious, if it finds any expression at all, and they enjoy it. They get a lot of satisfaction out of it, right? They will sacrifice people pretty readily if they suspect somebody's been compromised at all, and they even suspect that you're compromised. They'll use you as a channel toward which to direct this pent-up libido that would be associated for the generalized state of stress that they carry with themselves in life, like it's a load to be carried in life that you sometimes want to take some respite from, right? So you basically release it in what you deem to be an appropriate direction at people. Projection tends to go right along with it, defense mechanism-wise, Freudian defense mechanism-wise, with this release of pent-up libido, right? It becomes a cathexis directed out into the world along with a projection, right? And what was I just reading? Okay, in literature, a murder scene is often likened to a picture puzzle. If one is patient and keeps trying, eventually all the pieces will fit into place. Now, this is a practice where you want automaticity to reveal itself. That means you definitely are getting good. Maybe the habituated associated with it isn't so much traumatic as boring. For example, when you're habituating neurosis, you get pains in your muscles until things are truly automatic and you're thoroughly anesthetized in your neurosis, right? And you don't feel the pain there anymore, though the muscular tension remains, and efficiently so. It's chronic. There's a lot of stress pent up in there, and where there's stress, there's likely a combination of anxiety, rage, mania, depression. Depressive energies build up over time as energy transformations take place within the libido. Anxiety being the initial state, rage being a development of anxiety, and then depression being the thing that, rage transforms itself into over time as it remains as a chronic condition, right? Hair starts to fall out on your body, that sort of thing. As you age, maybe prematurely. Veteran policemen know otherwise. A much better analogy would be two picture puzzles, or three or more. no one of which is in itself complete. Even after a solution emerges, if one does, there will be leftover pieces, evidence that just doesn't fit. And some pieces will always be missing. There was the American flag, its presence adding still another bizarre touch to a scene already horribly macabre. Now, that could have been left by the perps or the people in the house as a similar symbol to the bunny rabbit left on the headboard, right? Above the headboard. Yeah, people with symbolic know would recognize it right off the bat, the meaning of it. Probably pretty accurately most of the time. Now the flag, yeah, same basic idea. On the couch that's being used for blackmail pornography, you know. The nation is in distress as the filming is taking place, right? The possibilities it suggested range from one end of the political spectrum to the other until Winfried Chapman told the police that it had been in the residence several weeks. Few pieces of evidence were so easily eliminated. There were the bloody letters on the front door. In recent years, the word, quote, pig, unquote, had taken on a new meaning, one all too familiar to the police. But what did it mean printed here? Well, pig's blood, maybe. There was the rope. Mrs. Chapman flatly stated that she had never seen such a rope anywhere on the premises. Had the killers brought it? If so, why? Probably that was the case. Capricorn symbol. But also a tool of utility in their activities. Okay. If you're involved in combat activities, little symbolic cues that you're carrying along with you that are purely symbols tend to be small things, right? If you need buckets of blood, you try to have those on site ahead of time, I guess. Or dropped from an airplane, who knows? Buckets of blood being dropped out the back of an airplane. That's a nice image to have in mind. What significance was there in the fact that the two victims bound together by the rope, Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring, were former lovers? Or was former the right word? What was Sebring doing there with Polanski anyway? It was a question too many of the newspapers would also ask. Now, according to the murderers' accounts, they had tied that rope around all four victims' necks. You know, the ones that were residing in the house that night, right? Present inside the house. So two of them escaped and tried to run off. Okay. Two did not escape, and they died inside the house, or quote-unquote died. The horn-rimmed glasses, negative for both prints and blood. That's interesting, because there'd be something on those glasses that could be lifted, right? So that would indicate they were left on the floor as, guess what? Another Capricorn symbol. Indicating, you know, you got so many Capricorn symbols all over the place. It's like people are, shall we say, leaving specimens up there on a regular basis while being filmed, okay? All kinds of activity going on in the house. It symbolizes that general range of activities. The horn-rimmed glasses, negative for both prints and blood. Did they belong to a victim, a killer, or someone totally unconnected with the crime? Or with each question, the possibilities proliferated. Had they been left behind as a false clue? The two trunks in the entryway. The maid said they hadn't been there when she left at 4:30 the previous afternoon. Who delivered them and when? And had this person seen anything? That's interesting. They would have to have been then delivered late in the day. That's something that could be brought up in the car, the Ford. Okay, the yellow and white Ford that had the rear seat of the car removed so it could be more like a pickup truck. Two trunks, one trunk in the trunk of the car, the other was kind of inside the car. You got buckets of blood inside the car along with the trunks maybe. Because the infant was delivered up there to the property inside a clothing trunk too. The glasses on the floor nearby. The infant fascinated by glasses, briefly in life. Trying to figure out what they're for, probably. Thinking, they're kind of a convenient toy to play with. Yeah, a lot of these symbols, the rope and the clothing trunks, could be symbolic of the infant JSK. The horn-rimmed glasses, negative for both prints and blood. Did they belong to the victim, a killer, or someone totally unconnected with a crime? Or with each question, the possibilities proliferated? And had they been left behind as a false clue? They're taking that into consideration, at least. The two trunks in the entryway. The maid said they hadn't been there when she left at 4:30 the previous afternoon. Who delivered them and when? And had this person seen anything? Why would the killers go to the trouble of sitting and removing a screen when other windows, those in the newly painted room that was to be the nursery for the Polanski's unborn child, were open and screenless? That is an interesting question. The infant might be able to answer that question if he could remember it. Yeah, according to the accounts I read in Chaos, somebody had slit a screen with a knife or something like that to get inside. Yeah, this is different from what I'm reading in the other book, I suspect. John Doe, 85, The Youth and the Rambler, Chapman, Garretson, and Tennant had failed to identify him. Who was he and what was he doing at 10050 Cielo Drive? Had he witnessed the other murders, or had he been killed before they took place? If before, wouldn't the others have heard the shots? On the seat next to him was a Sony AM/FM Digimatic clock radio. The time at which it had stopped was 12:15 a.m. Coincidence or significant? That's interesting. 12:15 a.m. That's 15 minutes after, like I said, he would probably have gotten off duty at 12. Maybe they had the beer up there in the garage, above the garage or something. Maybe it wasn't with Garretson, but the guard that came on duty, or who knows. As for the time of the murders, yeah, he would have had to have been in the guest house to find himself murdered rather suddenly and unexpectedly. Or maybe the oncoming guard that was there to replace him kept him busy, occupied with drinking a beer, right? As long as they're not drunk on duty, kind of a beer. Kept him, from paying attention to what was going on over at the telephone pole while Tex Watson climbed up there and cut the cables. That could have happened too. As for the time of the murders, the reports of gunshots and other sounds ranged from shortly after midnight to 4:10 a.m. Not all of the evidence was as inconclusive. Some of the pieces fitted. No shell casings were found anywhere on the property, indicating that the gun was probably a revolver which does not eject its spent shells, as contrasted to an automatic which does. Yeah. That many shots. Total of what? At least 5. Makes a rifle unlikely, too, right? Placed together, the 3 pieces of black wood formed a right-hand side of the gun grip. Okay. The police therefore knew the gun they were looking for was probably a .22 caliber revolver that was minus a right grip. Now, did they check it for prints? My guess is it was left there as a symbol. Would have been wiped clean, right? These gun grip parts. Sperm, Capricorn. From the pieces, it might be possible to determine both make and model, though there was human blood on all 3 pieces. They had enough for analysis. It tested O-MN, all caps, of the 5 victims. Only Sebring had O-MN, indicating that the butt of the revolver could have been the blunt object used to strike him in the face. Bloody letters on the front door tested OM again. Again, only one of the victims had this type and subtype. The word pig had been written in Sharon Tate's blood. There were 4 vehicles in the driveway. Oh, wait, OM. Again, only... Okay, let me reread that. The bloody letters on the front door tested O-M. Again, only one of the victims had this type and subtype. The word pig had been written in Sharon Tate's blood. There were 4 vehicles in the driveway, but one which should have been there wasn't. Sharon Tate's red Ferrari. It was possible that the killers had used the sports car to escape, and want was broadcast for it. And with that, I'll leave you there. We're 2.5 hours in. Thank you for listening.